Unless this is your very first episode ever of Data Skeptic, you're probably aware that we do different themes or seasons from time to time. For the last several months, our theme has been consensus. And while you're likely to hear that consensus intro music once or twice more as I squeeze in some final episodes, we're more or less finishing up the season. And we're busy at work at Data Skeptic HQ figuring out what's our new theme. Rather than jump right into it, we thought we'd try something different this time. This is the first of a couple of episodes in something I'm calling Pilot Season. We're going to try out a couple of prospective season-long themes. So if you hate this episode, don't worry about it. Tune in again next week and you'll hear something completely new. If you love it, tune in a couple of weeks when we're going to ask the audience to vote on what our next theme will be. In order to remove any survivor bias, voting will only commence once all the candidate seasons have been submitted to you for listening enjoyment. Here's the first of those. Allow me to present the prototype. This is Data Skeptic Conspiracy.
Canada, there was all these disembodied feet in running shoes that were turning up. Did you hear about this?
No, I haven't yet. Hey, that's my friend Carl Mamer from the Conspiracy Skeptic podcast. He's going to be joining me for this early bumper we're going to do at the beginning of conspiracy episodes where we try and solve a mystery as quick as we can.
For years, someone would just find a running shoe or some kind of shoe usually, but it usually was a running shoe, and there would be like a foot in it, and then not much of the foot above the ankle, and that's what they would find. And then they were like, oh my God. And at first they were looking, was it some sort of serial killer? Someone is killing people, chopping off one foot, leaving it around as a trophy. But no, but they're finding it's been waterlogged and stuff like that. And eventually what they sort of figured out is a lot of people die at sea, at Pacific Ocean. You fall off a boat and you fall into the water and you drown and you start to sink. And then fish eat your body, but they can't eat really usually into your shoe because a running shoe, they're super buoyant too. They float to the top, and then currents eventually just take them to certain areas on the west coast and they turn up. So originally it was like they're assuming there's some crazy killer out there. They could be dying off of the Kamchatka Peninsula, but eventually it'll swirl its way to a beach in Vancouver or something.
What a mundane explanation for a gruesome event. Welcome to Data Skeptic Conspiracy, the podcast in which we critically ask outrageous questions about alternative facts, alternative history, and alternative ideas in general. We've got the scientific method and the tools of data science at our disposal. It's not the fringe ideas themselves I'm interested in, but why people believe weird things, and how technology contributes to that process. Today on the show, our first interview is with Max Eliopoulos, where we're going to learn a little bit more about the data behind the QAnon conspiracy. After that, Carl's going to join us again to explore whether or not people are going missing from national parks at an alarming rate.
My name is Max Eliopoulos. I'm a PhD student at NYU's Center for Cybersecurity. My research spans what could be considered online malicious activity that has encompassed financially motivated online malicious activity, things like cybercrime, and more recently, hate and harassment motivated types of online malicious activity.
How much cybercrime is going on?
There's a lot of different types of cybercrime, and I think the answer would be different depending on who you would ask. So cybercrime can mean one thing in one country and a different thing in another. And I say that because there are certain countries where things that in the United States we would consider cybercrime are more normal operations or even sometimes state-backed operations. So there's a lot of cybercrime going on. That term cybercrime can mean a lot of different things. More specifically, the research that I've done in the past is on illegal cybercrime that isn't nation state-backed or anything like that. So cybercrime that is financially motivated and with the aim of basically taking victims in order to make money. The types of cybercrime I've studied are ransomware, where someone basically holds your computer ransom and requires you to pay a certain amount of money in order to get your files back. And more recently, we did a study on a carding forum where people buy and sell stolen credit cards in order to use them for fraudulent activity.
In a lot of those cases, I'm not a lawyer and I don't know all the legal systems in the world, but if you're stealing a credit card number, I got to believe that's illegal pretty much everywhere. So even though it's going on, at least one can assume the law is against that sort of cybercrime. But if we look at, as you say, the other side of things, more like cyberbullying and that sort of stuff, we bump into freedom of speech very quickly and anonymity issues and stuff like that. What are some of the modern concerns that people think about in this space?
Because of that being a hot topic these days, we see sites dedicated to promoting freedom of speech with little moderation. And by sites, I mean mostly a social networky type of site. And I think really what it comes down to in terms of that debate, freedom of speech and cyberbullying or hate or harassment, is a website's particular policies in terms of what they allow on their platform. So for more mainstream social networks, they have policies around hate and harassment. So you choose to use their site, that's your choice, and they then can choose to prohibit certain types of speech from happening if they consider it hate and harassment. But then there's other sites where they don't have such rules. And so as a result, individuals who want to participate online in speech that could normally be considered hate and harassment, they flock to those sites. And so it kind of becomes what is like a breeding ground for hate and harassment online that are not moderated, like you had said, have little anonymity, or have anonymity rather.
Well, the paper I invited you on to talk about today is titled The Gospel According to Q, Understanding the QAnon Conspiracy from the Perspective of Canonical Information. Actually, I think to kick this off, I want to just ask you a question I guess I took for granted most people knew because I've been hearing about this for a while, but I'm finding out a lot of my friends and family still have no idea. What the heck is QAnon?
I had a feeling you were going to ask me that question. And I was thinking a little bit about my answer, and it sort of boils down to the one conspiracy that kind of encompasses everything. QAnon is a online conspiracy theory turned real world movement that has been associated with not only online harassment and bullying, like we were talking about earlier, but also incidents of physical violence and inciting violence. But I say it's the one conspiracy that encompasses everything because it has information baked into its narrative that come from prior conspiracies that have circulated in predominantly the United States. So yeah, QAnon is this belief that there is an insider in the government who is leaking information on anonymous message board called, prior it was 4chan, now the thought is that the person is leaking information on 8chan, or 8kun rather, and the information that's being leaked is all leading up to the arrests of famous politicians or celebrities that are involved in what the believers think is a pedophile ring.
Yeah, that's something that's awfully surprising about it. I'm familiar with a lot of conspiracy theory claims. I mean, obviously conspiracies are true, but if you search for some top 10 list of conspiracies, I imagine I would be skeptical of all of them. And I think, the assassination of John F. Kennedy would probably be on that list. And I see we could have a long discussion about that, but I would not in any way consider myself a believer in any conspiracy theory related to that. I certainly believe we landed on the moon and stuff like that. But at least some of those things seem plausible. The idea that we didn't have a lone assassin, but there were two human beings can collaborate. It's not outside of reason that it just could have been different. Yet a lot of the QAnon stuff seems ludicrous to me. Am I in a bubble, or how is it that people consider this?
So for the purpose of this paper, and for me personally, I stayed away from delving into the depths of the content of the conspiracy, so what claims were being made, and fact-checking those claims or trying to gauge the legitimacy of them. That was a topic that we kind of took a step back from for this paper, and I personally have taken a step back from because there are other people out there, other researchers who are far more versed in what the actual claims are and have gone through the effort of debunking them for everyone else. I think in terms of how people come to believe these types of conspiracies online, I think it is a sociology issue, a issue that has to do with the state of the nation. I think that that's a more complicated question, that there are experts out there who would have a better take on why people come to believe them. The QAnon in particular was interesting and compared to other conspiracies, as we talk about in the paper, in the way that it's spread online. I think that that's one thing that could kind of give insight into why people believe it. It's because of the way that it's spread online.
Excellent point. I think the complete story here is going to require sociologists and psychologists and whatnot, but we can talk about the data-driven components because there's a strong digital footprint related to the QAnon conspiracy. Can you talk a little bit about what's available to study?
The conspiracy is spread or was spread on most mainstream social networks. So there's loads of data from people who believed the conspiracy, stating their claims online or having conversations about it in a public forum. In addition to that, there's all of the information that is considered to have been posted by Q themselves. So that information is available because it was posted publicly as well. And then there's these aggregation sites, which are websites where someone who is partaking in the conspiracy has aggregated information about the conspiracy into one place, and that includes the posts that they consider to have been made by Q. There's all these different data points. There's the people participating, there's the people kind of spreading it, and then there's the source of the information.
So when we talk about this Q figure, and you can comment if you're interested on any of the research about the true identity, but just from a more digital perspective, how is anonymity kept? And when you say there are things that are canonical versus not, how does any debate come up when we have messages being generated online from a supposed single source?
There has been a lot of debate about who is behind that persona, not only externally, so to researchers and observers of the conspiracy, but I think even more recently on the inside of the conspiracy as well. Because 4chan and 8chan/8kun are anonymous in nature, the only identity point that can be made about the person posting SQ is what is called a trip code. And it's a unique identifier that you need a password for, essentially, in order to post with that unique identifier. And so the thought is only one person has that password, so there's only one Q. And that's sort of the narrative that the conspiracy, I think at the beginning, wanted you to believe. What the data ended up showing was that according to the aggregation sites, these places where they kind of aggregate all the information about the conspiracy, we saw posts from multiple trip codes. So the site was claiming that Q was posting under multiple unique identifiers. And we also saw that what happened is the writing style of the individual changed across these identifiers. So what looked like one person writing at a particular point in time, when that identifier switched, it looks to be like a different person was writing, or at least the writing style changed a lot. So it kind of challenges that belief, okay, that Q is like one person on the inside of the government. It's actually perhaps, there's more people behind the scenes than are suspected.
With regard to the multiple trip codes, is that common on sites like that? Might it be someone has a laptop and a tablet and they log in from both, and that would be the reason to have more than one?
A trip code, because in order to write under one, you need essentially a password. You could write from the same trip code from multiple devices, from multiple places. It's just kind of like you're logging into your ID, and then once you can make posts under that ID. So the multiple trip codes, I think, were explained internally to the conspiracy, and I'm not an expert on the entire history, but from what I understand, when Q changed the part of the 4chan or 8chan site that they were posting on, the trip codes changed at the same time. There were also moments where those sites were taken offline, especially 8chan around the time of the Christchurch shooting, where the trip code, I believe, saw different posting activity. But maybe don't quote me on that for the record, because I don't know if that's accurate.
I've heard some of that history, and there's a complicated nature to the analysis for sure. But let's dig into the writing style specifically. So we have text from all of these posts. What about that text is useful to analyze?
Yeah, so there's this whole study of writing style online and offline called Stylometry, and it basically is a way of describing features of writing that could be used to identify a particular person or a particular person's writing style. So a lot of research has gone into understanding what actually those features are. If you were looking at someone's handwriting, it would be like, I don't know, the curve when they write a particular letter or something like that. But online, you have to use more quantitative and digital indications. So what we did was we looked at prior literature on stylometry and explored ideas like the number of digits that the person was using, or the number of special characters they were using, how many rich words in their vocabulary, things that were often different across different writers.
How strong of an indicator are things like that? I'll make a claim here that I can't support, but if you told me that, when I'm in a bad mood, I use a lot more punctuation and write shorter sentences and stuff like that, that's plausible to me. There's a natural variance to this kind of stuff. How predictable are these things? I'm sure I wouldn't be convicted in a court of law, but how much signal is in it in determining authorship?
When used alone, so when looking at, for example, punctuation alone or punctuation use alone, you're right, not very much a signal of a particular person's writing style. It could be more indicative of their mood or what they're talking about or a theme of their writing at that time. But when used in conjunction, if you're seeing similar trends across these different features, then you see a signal start to appear. So what we actually saw was that across several of these stylometric indicators, a particular trip code showed a different distribution in terms of use of all of the different features. So taken in a single example, not very interesting, but compared across a lot of these different indicators, now it starts to seem like, okay, this particular trip code is standing out in terms of its writing style and based on stylometric features.
So would you put forward a hypothesis of how many authors there are? Is the data separable enough in that way?
I think it's difficult to say a number. I don't think I want to make that a claim for a particular number, but I do think that what I began to think after doing this research was that there was more than one, that the writing style was different enough across some of these trip codes. And like I said, in that particular trip code that stood out, that gives me the belief that there's more than one person claiming to be Q.
If you looked at another scenario, I can't think of any famous authorship situations, but I'm sure we could build up a corpus of novels by one novelist and throw in a random one. How powerful, or would you maybe put some sort of general ballpark accuracy on the ability for techniques like this to really give us a clear signal in a general controlled case where we know the outcome?
Yeah, I think that the research prior literature has shown that these signals can be powerful, especially when used across a lot of data and especially when used in conjunction with one another. So again, not the individual feature, but used across a bunch of them at once, you can actually have an indication of who is writing a particular text based on their writing style using stylometric features. So much so that there are also techniques that people have worked on to anonymize your writing style. So basically do the opposite. Take a piece of text that you've written and examples of past text that you've written and make, a new piece of text look different in order to help anonymize your writing. So I think it's a well-studied field, but also people are still experimenting with new methods and new research and applying it to new scenarios, like in this conspiracy writing scenario.
These Q messages, or drops, I guess they're called, they're written with a certain language. There's something kind of awkward about them. I can't quite put my finger on a good description, but they're not natural language in a certain way. Could some of the nuance and flair of the way the writing is done make these exceptional, or do you think the existing stylometric features are robust to the style that they've been written in?
I can't say for certain, whether prior stylometry techniques are the best way to basically gauge how many authors there are. I've seen other researchers who have explored ideas like treating the Q posted text like a password and comparing basically the similarity across these texts as if they were passwords, because you're right, it does not look like normal prose, is incoherent almost always. So yeah, that's a good point. I think that there's still more room to explore other ways to discern how many authors there are besides traditional stylometry.
So I have a general curiosity in all things conspiracy, not that I necessarily am going to believe in them, but studying them from almost like a folklore perspective. I honestly have to confess, I don't think I have any interest in sitting down and reading through Q drops. Do you have any insight into what they contain? Could you save me the time and tell me a little bit about the contents based on some of your analysis?
We tried to, at the very beginning, look at more traditional techniques for identifying themes in the drops. So like summarization techniques or topic extraction techniques. These are concepts in natural language processing that people typically apply to more standard text that actually makes sense when you read it. What we saw was that they were not resulting in any useful themes or useful topics. Basically, it was you put garbage in and we got garbage out. What we did is we took a step back and said, okay, let's, instead of treating the text as a whole, as a theme or a topic, let's look at the individual words that are used and see if there's any relationship between the words that are used within the text. And so what we saw was by basically treating the words as the data point we were investigating, themes about religion, themes about insurgency in the United States, themes, again, about like pedophiles being arrested. And so, yeah, treating individual words as the data point really helped to bring out the themes in the text.
Could you tell me a little bit about perspective analysis, what it is and how it was useful in your research?
So the Perspective API is made by a group at Google called Jigsaw. They provide several models, machine learning models, to basically apply probabilities to text that they are of a certain category. These categories are things like toxicity or spam or incoherence. It basically gives you an idea of the probability that a given piece of text is any of these categories. So what we did was ran the text written by Q through these models, and we also ran other corpuses through them in order to have a baseline to compare the Q text to. What we saw was that although the Q text may not look toxic or more toxic compared to a baseline, it's certainly more incoherent. And it may be an obvious result, but kind of backed by these models showing that the text really doesn't make sense to a machine as well.
When you think about this QAnon event, it's something that I think a lot of people have followed for a while and never thought it would get this big, never thought that the Capitol might be stormed, which obviously is not a QAnon alone thing, but there was certainly some correlation there and a presence there. Was this an event that was just in the right place at the right time in social media and tech development, or do you think we'll see a series of conspiracy, cultish kind of things, and this will be just a part of global society going forward?
I think conspiracy has been part of global modern society, and especially online, for a long time. So that in itself, I don't think is going anywhere. What's unique about QAnon in particular is the way that it spread online, and especially the way that it was monetized online. People who spread the conspiracy, core conspirators, I guess, who made money off of making YouTube videos or selling merchandise or ad revenue from people visiting their aggregation sites. This theme of making money off of people believing a conspiracy, I find QAnon as one of the first examples and an outlying example of that type of behavior. Whether or not that happens again, I guess we'll wait and see. I think, we'd seen a lot change in terms of policy changes from websites like YouTube and Facebook, where, before someone could spread this conspiracy and make money off of clicks and views. Now they can't, because that type of content is not allowed on the platform. So if the social networks and others who were allowing for monetization are able to see the new conspiracy or the new, I guess, fringe belief start spreading and getting monetized and basically prevent that before it's happening, that's sort of what I'm anticipating or waiting to see if they can essentially get ahead of the curve on the next one. Because, like I said, the conspiratorial thinking has been around for a while, especially online.
So has something, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the Weekly World News. I used to get this at grocery store checkout aisles and would learn about all this crazy stuff like Bill Clinton having meetings with aliens and Bat Boy, and none of that ever led to a violent uprising, even though I think a lot of listeners will be familiar with that publication. Why is QAnon different?
I think a lot of it, in my mind, has to do with the state of the country. And again, I'm not a sociologist or a political scientist, but I think the level of polarization, specifically online, is at a place that our country hasn't seen before from my perspective. And I think that when you have people who are believing something that is not true to the point where the actual truth is a lie, that results in people who will be willing to essentially do anything in order to cause others to believe what they believe. And yeah, it was sort of like pouring gasoline on the fire every time, you would try to argue with someone who believed QAnon. I think that it's a mix of, the interconnectedness of people who are able to communicate about the conspiracy. They could basically always be online and talk about what they believe. So it's a mix between that and the polarization of the current polarization in the country online that kind of led to, violence in terms of this conspiracy.
There's a big discussion to be had here. You're welcome to comment on it if you'd like. I think it's a bit complex, and I'm not sure if I've made up my mind yet. And that's about the responsibilities that the platforms need to have. As you'd mentioned, they're changing curation of these sorts of things. I guess they're doing that on their own. Maybe there's discussion of legislation for these sorts of things. For sure, a very complicated issue. Like I said, you're welcome to touch on if you're interested. But in lieu of, the ethics of it, I'm wondering if you would comment on what the tooling would look like. How, from a purely data scientist, statistician, machine learning person, what are some of the methodologies and approaches you think will be fruitful in informing choices like that?
Yeah, I like the taking the technological approach, because whenever I think and start to think about, the responsibility of the platforms versus the government, for example, or the individual, to kind of enforce policy on a social network, those types of questions I like to leave to the policy folks, the people who have more experience than I do. From a technology point of view, you had brought up spam at the beginning of our conversation. And oftentimes what I feel is that treating some of these problems online, whether it's a conspiracy or hate and harassment, treating them like spam actually could lead to a lot of successful ways to detect and mitigate that type of behavior. So that's a very basic, quick answer. More technically, what happens under the hood is a lot of machine learning. So basically developing models that are capable of detecting certain types of policy breaking behavior, not very different than the perspective models, right? Their goal is to be able to detect toxicity, essentially. So developing more curated and specific machine learning models to detect policy breaking information. That's one way. Also understanding the networks of individuals who contribute to policy breaking information. So oftentimes, or almost most of the time, a social media site will have inherently a network that exists underneath it. And so, you can see this person's friends with this person comments on this person's stuff, and you can kind of build a web of their activity. So taking advantage of the information that's baked into that web of individuals and how they're connected online, you could see, the web of a policy breaking individual looks very similar to, this person's web, and, lo and behold, they actually are breaking policy. So it's the spam techniques, machine learning under the hood, and specific models for specific situations, and then understanding the relationships between people or individuals who are breaking policy in their network that I think will lead to better technologies for enforcing this type of stuff and detecting it before it basically spreads like crazy.
One of the directions you lay out in the conclusions of the paper for future paths forward is to do some analysis and explore how we might interpret what these drops mean to the adherents, and some perspective on, I guess, the takeaways they're getting. I actually was wondering if you could unpack some of the challenging aspects of that. When I've looked at a few of these Q drops, they read like gibberish to me. And I know there's a whole, not just, I don't know if there's an intended coding system, but these are almost deliberately meant to be read like there's some sort of cryptogram. That feels as though it's almost like a layer of encryption that's going to make it hard for machine learning to detect anything, when even I myself look at them and say, I can't interpret the context here. What can I expect of my algorithms? Do you see a path forward from methodologies and techniques, how we can fine-tune things to deal with cases like that, where the information is perhaps deliberately cryptic?
So a lot of the time, machine learning models start, especially the natural language domain, start with a base model that is trained on prior examples of text. An example of that is GPT-2, a model that made the news a lot lately for its ability to generate text, like writing news stories, essentially. In layman's terms, the way that model was trained was on a bunch of examples of text. So you're right in that you can't just take examples of regular text and expect that to work in a different domain where the text looks very different. I've actually found in prior work that I've done as well that the same holds true of other places online as well that are non-traditional, like cybercrime forums or cybercrime chat rooms, where the text doesn't look like something that a base machine learning model would have been trained on. So in order to fine-tune for these specific problem domains, you have to essentially accumulate enough example text from the specific domain. The best part about it, I guess, is that in order to get to a place where you have that base model, you don't have to do a lot of work once you have a lot of the text. It's computationally intensive and, resource intensive in terms of compute power, but you don't actually have to annotate a bunch of data or anything like that in order to create that base model. So I think in the future, in order to apply these more traditional models to specific domains, it's going to start with needing to have that base built up of example text from, a corpus of that specific domain. But that's not too difficult to do. So I'm definitely interested to see, what that results in, if that improves the results basically by having these base models for specific domains.
So the whole QAnon conspiracy must have started somewhere with one post and then grew in lots of different directions. Could you describe a little bit about the dynamics of that spread and maybe your thoughts on how we could have caught it faster?
In the early days of the conspiracy, what we saw was a lot of activity on the site Reddit. Specific subreddits were created to kind of spread information about the conspiracy. And I think at that point, what happened was it took a more mainstream adoption. What we actually saw in our paper was that the posts on Reddit were actually from a small amount of individuals. So this goes along with other types of abusive behavior online, in that it's actually oftentimes a small group of individuals who are responsible for the spread of the hate and harassment or the coordinated and authentic behavior or the conspiracy theory. And so what happened was Reddit took a stand, they banned those communities, and it actually did make a lasting effect on their site. So there was no, really new community that popped up on their site to the scale of the prior ones, but it didn't do anything to prevent the activity from continuing to spread on other sites like Twitter. So we also saw at the same time, the activity picking up on Twitter. Meanwhile, the posting continued on 4chan and later 8chan and 8kun from the individual from Q. And it wasn't really until, I think, Twitter, and we didn't show this in the paper, but it wasn't really until Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other platforms and YouTube decided to basically disallow all Q activity that the spread really stopped, because, to most, that's the internet, those sites. So the conclusion, I guess, is you could stop it on your site if you see the content as policy violating, but there's nothing that's going to do to stop the activity on other sites. And so I think more recently we've seen collaboration between social networking sites at the same time take down similar types of activity in order to basically prevent its spread from one place to the other.
Yeah, I might go so far as to say that these social media platforms are hypersensitive to this issue at the moment and probably trying to play catch up in a lot of respects, but I presume putting a great deal of effort into this problem. With the modern available tools, technology, algorithms, what have you, do you think they're prepared for the battle? Or are we going to see some other things like this before it gets better?
I think, like I was saying before, with enough example text of the type of content you're looking for, or enough example historical reactions or behavior online, you can actually begin to start to train algorithms and models to be able to detect it in the future. So I think that if anything, these sites and platforms now have a big corpus of training data. And so I suspect that in future examples, they will do a better job than before of getting ahead of the activity and detecting it. Not only conspiratorial activity like QAnon, but activity that incites violence or online harm. I think that they are progressing in this space, and I expect that they will continue to do so, because there's only so much that you can do to hide that type of behavior online from the platform that you're posting it on.
Well, Max, what's next for you in your line of research?
The biggest project that we have related to this right now is studying some types of multimedia data that were posted on sites like Parler. So basically, as you may have heard, Parler data was grabbed before the site shut down. It was crawled from the site, and that included the images that were posted. So future work that we hope to explore is the type of imagery that's posted on a site like Parler, what types of themes and groups of images exist, and also whether the behavior or the posting volume on Parler changed before and after it was deplatformed, essentially trying to understand if deplatforming has an impact on the community that it happens to.
That's very interesting. Yeah, it's almost, you could draw some parallels to Reddit shutting down some of this discussion. Is that a fair comparison, and would you care to comment on it at all?
Yeah, certainly. There's actually a specific group of sites now called the communities.win sites, which essentially are subreddits alternative subreddits that after getting banned from the traditional Reddit site, they created their own alternative version of the same community. So that actually warrants a very perfect, I guess, case study for understanding, how banning a specific subreddit affects the individuals who later participate in the alternative version of the same community, all in the realm of trying to understand the outcomes of deplatforming and enforcing policy on the individuals who were partaking in the policy violating communities.
Max, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your research and expertise.
Thank you very much for having me.
More about Max Aliopoulos and his work can be found in our show notes. For the next segment, I'm going to bring Carl back on to discuss a lesser-known conspiracy, but one I find kind of fascinating, the missing 411.
But so there's missing 411, and you've pretty much done the, you are the skeptical voice of this missing 411 thing, are you not?
I seem to be. I'll gladly take the banner as the skeptic of record.
Okay, yeah.
Happy to share if someone else wants to come along and indulge in this research too, but I think I've well explored it.
Yeah, because the guy who originated, David, and you pronounce his name a lot better than I could ever pronounce it. Could you pronounce his last name? Pilates. Almost like the exercise you do with the ball, kind of, isn't it?
Oh, Pilates. Yeah, along those lines.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Pilates. All right. I'm gonna mess up his name anyways.
Fair enough.
So Dave, let's just call him David. So anyways, this David character, he was a former police officer. Mm-hmm. He was an outdoorsman, like going to national parks, but he was also like a big Bigfoot hunter too. He had a big history as a Bigfoot hunter, and
but Linus Pauling had weird ideas about vitamin C. So do we have to hold that against him? I don't know.
I'm not saying this is, like, hey, he's a Bigfoot hunter, so he's an idiot, so discount him. But he does have an interesting past. I'll put it that way. So he's a
for certain,
yeah. A former police officer who kind of, people think they see a pattern and then just run with it. And so he sort of began to think that people are visiting national parks. This is in America, your nation. I'm up here in Canada. But he did extend it to Canada, and I think broaden it basically the entire world. But the idea that people are going and missing in national parks and in numbers that defy and they're going missing in ways that defy explanation. And the national parks are federal territory, so it's kind of controlled by the American federal government, and the park rangers, the federal employees, and they're very hush-hush about these people going missing. Does that sort of basically encapsulate the core of missing 411?
You could get into a lot of nuance on the main proponent, David Pilates' ideas about the National Park Service. He is like one of these outdoorsman types, and it seems legit. Like he's probably a great guy to go on a fishing trip with. And I really mean that, and like go on the hikes and the whole shebang. But he kind of comes to the table of the project as like the people who operate the day-to-day of the national parks. They're good people. They're salt-of-the-earth types, blue-collar. Those are good people. It's the vague administration and the bureaucracy that is possibly compulsory or at least negligent in all of this.
And it's almost like a cottage industry for him, right? He's written
6 books, 2 documentaries. I wouldn't even take as strong of a stance. I'll grant Pilates quite a bit about, he's not a liar. I verified a lot of the cases in the books. There are some, like little nitpicks here and there. He gets someone's age off by a small amount, but I mean, he's factually reporting actual tragic situations of real people. The only thing he sees that I don't is a connection.
That's, kind of classic conspiracy thinking, right? Connecting dots that should not be connected. I mean, you probably have a better appreciation of that as sort of a data scientist. It's like, when can I draw a line between these dots,
Well, whenever you'd like. The question is, does it represent the data?
Yeah, exactly. So people sort of seeing these random dots and then kind of forcing a narrative on top of them. Although I don't think this Pilates guy is really forcing much of a narrative. It's more kind of a, hey, this is weird, fill in the details.
I would even say he's gone to pretty good lengths to not ascribe a source. Even in the most recent documentary, he says, we're still investigating, we may have a breakthrough soon, but he doesn't want to define the big bad.
These things become cottage industries, right? one person has this idea, and then people just build and build on top of that, and not just sort of build in original ideas, but they'll just grab stuff from other things and sort of layer on top of it. It just becomes like, that becomes the new mythology.
Right. That's what's been really interesting to me about it. It does feel like a living mythology. I mean, conspiracy theories like QAnon have gotten a lot more press and publicity, but Missing 411 is not, maybe not in the same order of magnitude as something like QAnon, but it's a socialized idea in a lot of the more, conspiracy-minded circles.
What kind of like math did you actually? Because this is Data Skeptic. Usually you talk about much more. You get more down to the hardwood, like formulas, and you throw out theorems and things like that. And
when we
you talk to smart people, Kyle, and say something smart. Because I'm taking the average down here.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there was very little math I could do when I went to approach the Missing 411 topic, because there isn't a whole lot of math to it. I mean, I guess I could have gone deeper in looking at statistics, like what is the baseline rate at which you would expect people to disappear from a national park?
Right.
It's not going to be zero, in the same way unemployment is never zero. Right. Somebody's going to disappear themselves on purpose every once in a while, and a national park is a convenient way to do it. Someone is going to commit suicide by getting lost in the wilderness or whatever. So it's never going to be zero. If you tell me it's 20%, that's alarming, and I'm even open to the idea that the rate of alarm is much lower, but I'm just not sufficiently convinced we're there.
Well, I mean, Toronto has like a subway system, and people take their lives. It's very sad that people jump in front of trains, right? But try to find statistics on how many suicides a year happen, in a Toronto subway, and they don't publish that because they don't want to give people ideas, because they don't sort of publish that sort of details, and national parks again, maybe they don't want to give people ideas like just, hey, looking to off yourself? Hey kids, life's intolerable. Come on down to the national park, and like we got cliffs you can jump off of, just rub yourself with bacon, bears will come and get you. There's hot springs you can jump into. Sure. You're not going to last long. Yeah, a lot of great ways to off yourself in a national park, kind of thing. And they don't want to promote that, right? So I can well see if it's like those stats are hard to come by,
That's true. And to be fair, I didn't look deep into it, but it does bring us to one of the big parts we haven't touched on in Pallades' narrative, and that's that the national parks, there's the big bad guy of the bureaucracy, but they're also kind of, in his opinion, unwilling to work with him. He finds it appalling that they don't keep lists of this stuff. He has filed a number of FOIA requests and been unhappy with their responses. But no, it does not surprise me that they don't keep accurate records of who disappeared and when they were recovered, because I think 90% of missing people are found. And I don't know the number, but I know it's quite high because there's no official total, at the tail end of it. And that was within the long tail. I mean, Missing 411, is this hurting anybody? No, not particularly. In some cases, like a lot of skeptics will go after psychics, and they'll label them as grief vampires, which I think is a fair thing, and they try and swindle people. Pallades is not a swindler. His books are pretty expensive, but, I understand what it is to self-publish. There's no nefarious angle on this per se. Yeah. So
he doesn't have a compound in Montana and telling you to give up all your worldly goods and join his compound.
Not at all. When it comes to conspiracy, sometimes the facts are in dispute, but there's also room for us to agree on the facts, but disagree strongly on the interpretation. If you like this pilot episode, tune in a couple of weeks when we're going to have our voting. If we move forward with Data Skeptic Conspiracy, we'll get into topics like rationality, Bayesian beliefs. We'll explore some true conspiracies, because there are some real ones. They may not involve aliens or supernatural things, but they're out there. Of course, we'll talk about social media, algorithms, search engines, and the influences these technologies have on why people believe things. Thanks to Carl and Max for coming on the show today. This has been Data Skeptic Conspiracy.